stream several times already with everything. So what I was saying is that a series of events told in sequence is not a story. A story for me, and many other people who write about and study storytelling, is that there's a point. There's what Brian McDonald calls an armature. There's what a lot of people call the spine. And basically, the idea is that you have you have the there's a reason you're telling the story, and that reason is usually change, whether it's an environmental change or a character change. And what I like about that is that there can be a really succinct story, or there can be a really long, in-depth story with a lot of different intricacies and things. And as long as there is change for a reason, and that reason makes sense, then that's a good story structure. And so, I think the simplest form of story is introducing the normal, having an exciting incident that challenges the normal, and then changes things, and then you have the new normal. And so you kind of just say, here's this thing, and then this thing is no longer going to be that way, and then here's the new normal. And you can expand on that. And Victor is saying technical difficulties day. Absolutely. I'm hoping to get all of my technical difficulties out in this one stream, maybe for the month or something.
So connecting that to the theme, what we started with a normal stream, then there were complications. Now we are in the new normal.
Yeah, so the idea would be I started this thing, and you could see that I have no idea what I'm doing, and the sound was off. And then through some inciting incidents of the chat saying, I can't hear anything, you idiot, I changed some things, and now the new normal is me knocking stuff off of my table and turning the stream off again. So I've learned nothing, and by definition, I'm a flat character. So that's
well, by learning nothing, it's just it's like the ending of The Graduate. You're just very postmodern. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I tend to be drawn to simpler stories, and I do think we all know. I guess a story would be just kind of a retelling of events, but a good story, there's a difference, I think, between just a story and then a good story. And I think the main thing is a good story is going to have a beginning, middle, and end. And I think we've all had conversations with people who start a story and it goes nowhere.
yeah.
And you're just oh, okay. So we're just kind of doing this story forever. It's never gonna are we going somewhere? You know what I'm talking about? The people who give completely useless information.
Yeah.
Story where it doesn't lead anywhere. And I think if you've experienced that talking to someone, or maybe you've experienced telling a story like that, where you're just sensing the people listening kind of distancing themselves from the hook, the crux of your story. And that's probably because it's not advancing anywhere.
Yeah.
And so the idea is you need some kind of advancement in a story and some kind of resolution, whether it's a fulfilling resolution or not. So it's kind of and I mean, comedians use this all the time too, where they'll start a joke or they'll do a bit and they'll do a tag, which is kind of referencing something that it's almost putting a pin in it so that later on they can use that tag to get to a punchline. Yeah. Or they might use multiple tags to get to a punchline. And if there's no punchline and a bunch of tags, it's you will probably watch that comedy special and no callbacks to there's devices to it. And if those devices aren't used, it can really lead to kind of a dead, non-existent comedy.
Right. And so that's something that I think is that's something that I think is really interesting, is the idea of the promise.
Yeah.
And in your comic, you called it the stakes, right? Which is a common. But basically, if you don't open with a promise of what you're going to deliver, then there's no reason for anybody to care about it. And
Yeah.
so, but if you open with a promise and then you don't deliver on your promise, that's almost even worse because it's just not. It's unfulfilling. It feels empty and hollow. It's like, I mean, I can think of several TV shows. The reboot of Battlestar Galactica, Lost, like where it was like all promise. It was like we're going somewhere with this. It's all crazy. Look at all the stuff that we're setting up, and then there's like no payoff in the end because they didn't have a plan. They're just
Yeah.
kind of like writing as they went. Um, that's terrible. It's like if I say, hey, if you hang out with me for like an hour and a half, at the end of this, I'll buy you dinner, and then you stick around for an hour and a half, and then I'm like, all right, well, I'll see you later.
Ha.
It's like, what? And so, like, I didn't care if you bought me dinner or not, but then you said you were going to, and so I stuck around, and so
Yeah.
now you didn't, and it's kind of like that in story as well. Like, most people think that the problem with stories is how they end, but in actuality, if you don't, a problem in the third act is actually a problem in the first act because you've got to
Yeah.
set up the pins that you're going to knock down later.
Yep.
And when people say things, it's both funny and annoying. But when people say things like, "Oh, that was unbelievable," and they say it about something where there's a talking raccoon in an anthropomorphic tree in space or whatever, and it's like
Ah,
that's the part that's unbelievable. What they're actually saying is, in the beginning of this movie, they didn't set up the rules of this world correctly because they broke their own premise. They're not delivering on their promise. Like if I start something and I start it by saying, in the story I'm about to tell you, there's magic and there are weird creatures and this guy over here has this superpower, right? Then when those things happen, it's fine because I've made that promise. But if all of a sudden some element comes in that is completely breaking the rules of what I promised at the beginning,
yeah.
then people say, "Oh, that's unrealistic." And it's like, no, the whole thing is unrealistic. You're watching fiction. But like the part that's unrealistic is that we're now introducing elements after the first act that don't belong here because we didn't set up those pins, so we can't knock them down.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example, one of my pet peeves in stories is when a story is told at a specific pace where you're following along with the character methodically throughout their life. And then it does a 10 years later, and you're like, wait a second, wait a second. And I mean, there's books that are incredibly well regarded that have pulled that at the end.
Yeah.
And I use like a perfect case in point, and I will talk crap about it with the premise of it's still one of the most brilliant books in sci-fi, but Ender's Game
Oh
really
yeah.
bothered me as a book because you follow this amazing story and it's kind of timed in a certain way, and then it is like the last chapter is just like 10 years later the aliens, and like it just throws in
Yeah.
like this new plot line and kind of skims through all the plot points that and resolutions, and I feel like had there been some of that kind of timing placed earlier,
Yeah.
then it wouldn't have felt so like jarring when it goes 10 years later, because most of the time that feels very sitcom-y.
Right.
And I think the reason for it is, once again, you haven't really set the expectation for that kind of timing. However, keep that in mind when you're writing, because if you want something to be really jarring
Yeah.
and really what the heck, like, and it's planned, um you can do that to kind of throw people off, where I've seen people do that with some effective, like Game of Thrones is a good example, although it's done in a clever way, but it's like starts as if magic is just kind of this reference thing
Yeah.
that used to be like it's possibly mythology or whatever, but it's in the folklore of the people. And then gradually they bring in magic. And, so when you start, you're not really buying in, like at first, to the idea of, I'm reading a book with dragons.
Right.
But by the end, they have you, following these dragons, writing, and people, using magic and all this insanity. Um, and it's gradually brought in. But when it comes in, it still doesn't feel like, wait a minute, because you have had those little tales like strewn throughout.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. It is an interesting thing, but I think I do think this will be a much longer topic for another time too. But I do feel like maybe we should explain like why you're drawn to structure in a story, and
Yeah.
I can get into why I like to use structure, and in my case, like and I think we just both kind of agreed, possibly like simple structures, like old structures, like why use them?
Yeah, I don't mind simple or complex as long
Yeah,
as it's a good story,
yeah,
and so the complexity of it. But my challenge is that oftentimes what people mistake for intellectual work is actually just confusing,
yeah,
and I don't buy into the you can tell a complex story, and it won't feel complex, but then when you step back, you're like, man, that is a lot of complexity. But if it feels complex, it's probably actually more confusing and unclear than it is complex. And so I don't know if I'm arguing with myself or not there, but I want to I guess I want to take the idea off the table. You're not saying this, but a lot of people think of the idea of simple as being simplistic,
yeah,
and that's not true. I believe that simple is clear. Simplistic is a different thing. But yeah, as far as why, I could dive into why a lot, because I feel like storytelling is like ingrained in the survival of humanity. Like I believe that we tell stories, as a way to survive as a species. I think that's how we learn and adapt and grow. And like it's interesting to me that like every major ancient culture like tells the creation story of how people came to be. And in that creation story that there are lessons of like how you should act, how you should treat each other, some of the rules that you should follow and the rules that you should not break,
yeah,
the consequences of breaking those rules and what happens when you defy certain conventions. I think it's less about like, oh, this is an interesting point of history, and more about like our society is based on this, and we're teaching that to everybody by telling the story.
yeah,
And it's kind of like everybody gets really sick of hearing the origin stories of superheroes, and I'm amongst the people who, have said, oh man, if I see, Spider-Man's origin story one more time, I swear I'm going to lose it. But then, you have like Into the Spider-Verse, and they literally did that intentionally to like they did both that timing thing that you do, but did it well, where they're talking about like speeding up and slowing down, but also like they're like, all right, we're gonna do this one more time, and like they kept going into that thing, and they actually used that instead of like well, I don't really know where to start. They used that as a way to do kind of like a Rashomon thing where they like kept going back to telling different parts of the story and kind of like a nod to itself and whatever.
yeah,
The point of all this is to say, I think we naturally as human beings recognize storytelling forms, and I
yeah,
think it's kind of like science. Science doesn't create nature, right? But what science does is it observes and studies and explains what it has observed and studied, and it
yeah,
like science didn't invent gravity, but they describe it well. And I think it's the same thing with story structure. I don't think that we've actually come up with story structure. I think that's something that's ingrained in us as human beings, and I think people have gotten really good at understanding like what attracts people to verbal or verbal or visual or whatever type of communication. There's
yeah,
certain things that are engaging and other things that are not. I think those are intrinsic and natural, and I think people, as storytelling scientists, have observed those things and been able to draw those things out. And talking about Aristotle and others, I mean they literally thousands of years ago were like, when you do this with a story, people will pay attention to it. When you
Yeah.
don't do this with a story, you're going to lose your audience.
Yeah,
And
and I think it's very similar to like there's structure to a lot of comedy, and a lot of comedians learn that structure the hard way by just bombing on stage over
right,
and over again, and then kind of go, oh, okay, but if I do this,
yeah,
and then all they're doing is just kind of mapping it out, or it's equivalent to like rules of typography, where you can break the rules, but you might end up with a book like, let's say you broke all the rules of typography, you're going to give people headaches when
yeah,
they're reading a book. Or the grid, like the grid structure of graphic design, where there are literal like shape, like it's kind of like an optical illusion of different shapes and how they interact with each other and different ways of framing, that psychologically affect people in a certain way.
yeah,
So you can use those rules. You can accidentally stumble upon those rules every once in a while and have people go, "I really like this, and I don't know why."
yeah. And you
And
say, I don't know why either because I haven't been able to recreate it.
yeah, and generally you'll notice if they like your framing of a photograph, it's because you divided it into thirds. And like
Right.
it's I mean, there's these things that are unspoken, but we all kind of are drawn to them when they're done. So the thing that's neat about, to me, like the reason I like to use kind of a simple story structure when I'm starting out, first off, it keeps me on point because writing can end up being a paper chase where you end up like lost. You can end up lost with just going off on tangents with different characters,
Yeah.
and and you need some kind of map to kind of keep you guided so that you'll better get to your destination. There are some people who I think are naturally gifted at storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
and so might not even need to map out a structure. Like they might just inherently have a structure to it. Or maybe there's something so compelling about their story. Like I'm trying to think of one, like Magnolia is a good example of a story that kind of throws out structure, but it's done in such a fascinating way, and it has this total cop out ending. But it's like watching the film, these arcs kind of tied out so beautifully that the ending's kind of perfect because there is no way to tie those threads, but they were all really beautiful threads. It's a weird scenario. So there's times where you can kind of throw the rules out the window and I think get away with it. But I think most of the people who do that effectively are like a good artist who's kind of saying, okay, I know you're not supposed to do this, but I'm going to do it intentionally, to this, like, type. Like one of my favorite graphic designers, Chip Kidd, like on the legals for his books, he just has them go halfway off the page and then you turn the page and they continue on the other side. Um, and I mean, he's been like the creative director for Knopf for years, so I think he knows how to design a book and follow a grid. He just
Yeah.
intentionally split the grid just for fun.
Right.
And
Well, it's kind of like Gestalt theory, right? Where we're talking about
yeah,
like perception. They're like most of most of what we call like the rules of design or the rules of composition or whatever are based on these German psychologists who were trying to understand how our brain perceives things that we see, and there's like all these rules, and we kind of memorize the forms of those things. But if you don't understand like the biological imperative of why those things exist, I don't really think that you can actually design intentionally well. And so, for example, like if you understand figure ground, and you understand that things that bulge outward and move, and break up things that are in front of them and obscure other things, are considered a focal point or a figure, versus like a background, then you're going to do things unintentionally, and the hierarchy of your composition is going to suffer. And if you know that that's a biological imperative, because if I wake up and I stick my head out of my hut or my tent, the thing that is a figure is likely a threat or a food source. Like there's a strong drive to understand like the hierarchy of a design, because it's actually based in like survival and mating. It's like if that thing moves, I might be able to mate with it, or it might try to kill me. And so
Yeah.
like identifying those things, and it's kind of like that with story structure for me is like I think that you might stumble on it. You might do a good composition occasionally,
Yeah.
accidentally, and you might just be copying other compositions that you've seen. You might write a good story, by just saying, well, I don't know, like in this other story, like this stuff happened, and so I'll just kind of like do that, but change it a little bit. But until you actually understand like the underlying themes, of why we are drawn to particular story structure, I don't think you're going to be able to like master that, like break those rules intentionally or use them effectively in a way that will like help bring your audience along. Anything that you really do up until that point becomes like somewhat haphazard and kind of happy accidents. And I think you
Yeah.
can get by for a long time on happy accidents, but I think at some point in time, like a serious study of the craft of what you're doing is kind of essential.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think you like just drawing it back to kind of visual theory and stuff. It's like I remember having students who every once in a while would like have a really cool illustration that like utilized like rebatment, and they'd be like, "Oh, you used rebatment," and they're like, "What's that?" And
Right?
and you're like, "Okay, so the next thing you turn in isn't going to use that because
Yeah.
inevitably you're not going to know the reason what you're doing is working
Right.
until you start learning those rules, and then it becomes repeated, and that's kind of the point of like structure of basically anything. Like why structure anything in life, and it's mainly so that it can be repeated.
Yeah.
Because once again, like my goal is like hopefully I have a story that's hard for readers to read, but it's not hard to understand.
Yeah.
Like just heavy. And like to me, it would be really hard as a writer or an artist to like tackle a really serious topic in a way where I might lose half my readers on where exactly I'm heading or what the purpose of something was.
Yeah. And I
So
don't think that's necessarily because you are telling a particular type of story. I think that's
yeah.
true of all stories. You can have a
Mhm.
super upbeat, action-packed whatever, and it'll feel super boring if I don't understand why things are going on or what's going.
Yeah.
If they're not making promises and delivering on those promises, if there's not like a three-act structure, if I don't see any characters change, there's no new normal, there's no inciting incident. Like it's just people shooting each other or funny things happening, and that's like a lot of like the gimmicky animation like early on, like everything was set up. This is I'm reading that book, and this is what Walt Disney brought to animation. Was he was like people should care about the characters, like it's all
Yeah.
about and this book that I'm reading, they're like he didn't do anything different. He was doing the same visual gags and the same, this guy gets hurt, or whatever, but what he added to it was like the fact that the audience should care about it, because it was the emotional reaction of the characters on the screen to that event that really like drew you in, and you see like you see Felix the Cat and other things of that era, and you compare that to where I mean when Donald Duck, when something happens to Donald Duck, I mean he gets pissed, he loses it, like and that's like a relatable thing, and
Yeah.
so the 100 Acre Woods characters are all like relatable in their flaws. The Disney characters are all relatable in their emotional reactions. That
Hmm.
your story is relatable, in the struggle of it, or other people's story is relatable in like the flawed heroism, or whatever. Like it's the relatability and humanity and authenticity of those stories that engage us. It's not the
Yeah.
fact that there's an explosion, and it's like Brian McDonald points this out, like when the Death Star blows up for the first time, because then they did it a bunch of times or whatever. It wasn't because it was a big explosion that we cared about it, but it was because it was the conclusion of Luke's story arc. Like in the
Yeah.
beginning, he trusted tech and wanted to do techie things, and in the end he learned to trust his feelings, and the result of that was that the bad guys blew up. And so if somebody looks at that, they often learn the wrong lesson and they're like, that explosion was big and people loved it. And so if I make a bigger explosion, people will love it more. Like
And you
people likes that
see,
shark, so if I have two sharks, it'll be amazing, or whatever.
yeah, you can definitely see that in action too with just start Googling like the Star Wars knockoffs that came out right after Star Wars, where a bunch of studio execs were like, it was successful because it was knights in space.
Right.
And it's like, no, it was successful because it was a mapped out story.
Yeah. Right. It was successful because we saw like a round character go
Yeah.
from here's normal to this inciting incident to a bunch of series of events that change him over time to here's the new normal where he's changed and better and more powerful. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like
Every
really
little,
engaging.
yeah. And little elements of relatability, like you were talking about before, where it's like one of the things that's great about the first scene with the Millennium Falcon is it's like an old junker car. Like he's having trouble starting his engine
Right.
on this giant spaceship, and I don't know if I'd really seen that. I mean, there have been the sci-fi stories where somebody's abandoned or stranded as like a gimmick to get them on some foreign
Right.
planet. Rarely had like the hero trying to escape the bad guys in their car stalls, like
Yeah.
in
Well,
space.
and in those situations, their ship was still like a pristine machine. It still looks amazing, right?
Yeah,
And that was something that and you're talking about reality and relatability and things feeling real in a universe where there's like talking teddy bears and like people with like green skin and like, fish head humanoids and whatever. But the fact of the matter is that like the fact that the ships are rusty you
yeah,
know like it really sold it because you're like, yeah, I guess like if there's like this kind of like used car market and these things are like going in and out of atmospheres, like that actually makes way more sense than like 2001 Space Odyssey of like pristine shiny everything, not a scratch on it. It's
yeah,
like, no, I mean, like that droid has been sandblasted because it's been in the desert. So yeah, the paint's going to be rubbing off, and he's not going to be like this perfect shiny Cylon. It's going to be like barely functioning. Smoking and spitting oil and everything. All over the place, and so like the fact that like I've driven cars like the Millennium Falcon, where like when it works, it's great, but
yeah,
but you do have to kind of like hit it with things and kick it
yeah,
occasionally, and
right. Yeah,
yeah. And so there's like those points of relatability. Like people will believe and feel related to almost anything as long as there's some humanity in it.
exactly.
So
Sweet. Well, I think we gotta pinpoint this for another point because I do love talking about story, and this has kind of improved my mood a bit
yeah,
despite all the technical difficulties. So you see, there's a full arc. Like we started kind of down, and then we faced obstacles. We overcame those obstacles, and now we have, I think, a healthy conclusion.
yeah, yeah. So that's good. Oh man, if you guys want to see the stories that we are telling, then you should go to joshuakemble.com and check out Quarterly Stories, which is also available on Tapas, which is a mobile app that you can get on your phone or your iPad or your tablet. And you can read it mobile, and it's really awesome. You should do that. If you want to check out the stuff that I'm doing, you can go to corykerr.com. And I believe you're on my channel right now. If you're still around, those of you that have like stuck around through me like fat fingering my thing off my desk so that it actually turns the stream off several times, um, that's awesome. But if you haven't, like this video, hit that little thumbs up and the bell and subscribe and all that jazz, and go check stuff out at corykerr.com. We'll see you guys in a week where hopefully I will have learned my lesson and completed my story arc and had fewer technical difficulties. See you guys in a couple days.